What's going on, guys? Hope this video finds you well. So if I'm being honest, I don't really know where exactly to begin with this video. As of recording this, I'm a few weeks removed from finishing my Final Fantasy VIII playthrough, so I'm not sure how much detail I really want to go in. I have pretty much my entire playthrough recorded, so I have the footage if I wanted to go into extreme detail, but I just don't really know if that's entirely necessary. So with that said, I suppose I'll start with my experience with this game prior to this most recent playthrough. Being back in 2020, I decided to delve into Final Fantasy as a series, as I played 15 when it came to Xbox in like 2016 or something like that. But it's a series that kind of passed me by since I started gaming on the N64. So Final Fantasy obviously pivoted to PlayStation from that generation going forward. And so I didn't really have reliable access to these games prior to the Nintendo Switch ports. And so when the pandemic hit in 2020 and I didn't have much better to do, I figured let's dig into the backlog a little bit. And so I played through Final Fantasies 4 through 9 to varying degrees, and the two that I actually didn't finish being 5, which I'll get back to at a later date, and 8 as well, but for pretty different reasons and at very different points in the game. So Final Fantasy VIII, I got very far in on my first attempt. I want to say I made it to disc 4, which is like the very end of the game. Disc 4 is a pretty short disc, all things considered. But at the same time, while a lot of the set pieces were memorable from my first playthrough this time around, there was a lot that I had completely forgotten or had dismissed, I guess, on my first playthrough. Because I definitely didn't finish my first playthrough, or my first attempt of Final Fantasy VIII. It wasn't until this most recent replay that I actually pushed all the way through to the end. And I'm glad I did, so that way I can talk about it in full, because Final Fantasy VIII is, while loved by some people, definitely one of the more heavily criticized Final Fantasies, I'll say, especially being between fan favorites 7 and 9. And while there is plenty that I have to criticize Final Fantasy VIII for, I think this second playthrough has made me appreciate it a bit more and has me considering the extreme amount of potential that this game has that was not fully realized with its initial release. To the point where I would actually love to see a Final Fantasy VIII remake, and this is kind of one of those games where it's a case for remaking a game that isn't already beloved. It's taking a game that is heavily flawed in certain ways and remaking it for the sole purpose of refining and improving on the areas where the game faltered initially. And that happens with these fan favorite remakes as well to certain degrees, but it seems like kind of a shame for Square to be remaking FF7, albeit in a totally different style of remake than is typical. And then there's the rumored Final Fantasy IX remake, and the fact that they're skipping 8, while it makes sense, it also just kind of leaves this game in the dust, where I think a remake actually could shine pretty brightly and ideally live up to the potential that Final Fantasy VIII has. And so with a lot of that kind of exposition, experiential stuff out of the way, I figure I might just jump into different aspects of the game and kind of talk about what I thought of them, mostly in broad strokes. Maybe I'll get into some details here and there, and then kind of provide maybe some ideas or just general solutions to some of the aspects that I think are lacking. But generally the game holds up not too bad visually. Like, the characters are full scale, and yeah, the face textures and textures in general are pretty low res, but I can forgive that because at least stylistically they look fine. They look like actual human beings in their proportions. And the music, as always with this series, is excellent. I do think that in all the PS1 games, there are certain tracks that sound very MIDI, particularly when the music is trying to emulate more traditional instruments, but a lot of the more electronic kind of sounding stuff with lots of synths and whatnot sound excellent even in this form. Although it would be nice to hear the soundtrack fully realized and fully orchestrated and all that. I think that'd be incredible. Now, without getting too into spoilers too early, I guess I'll just say Final Fantasy VIII's plot has a really interesting premise once you see it in full. The way I felt about this game on a first playthrough versus how I felt on a second playthrough, knowing when certain plot points are going to happen, left me with very different impressions on each of those playthroughs. Because Final Fantasy VIII has a number of major reveals and twists that feel very contrived on a first read. And while they do still seem somewhat contrived in some way on a second pass, I think knowing the big picture and then seeing some of these perceivably contrived plot plot points come to a head makes it a little bit more forgivable, although there are some specific instances where I think it could have been done better, and I'll get into that once I get more into spoilers. But I'd say generally, the story from the beginning all the way through disc 1 is really pretty solid, actually. I quite enjoyed, even on a first playthrough, the story for that first disc. The second disc has some moments that come out of left field, but generally still left me with positive impressions. And then when you get into disc 3 and then disc 4 is when things kind of go off the rails, and is kind of where I started to dismiss the story on my first playthrough. This time around though, as I said, knowing where certain plot points kind of come from, and at least somewhat understanding how it connects to other aspects of the story, made me much more open-minded to a lot of the plot in disc 3 and 4, and actually left me with generally positive impressions of the overall narrative, despite there being some flaws here and there. I think this is actually a rare game where I find the actual plot to be way more interesting than the characters, whereas I feel like in a lot of games, the character work tends to carry the game more than the actual plot. Which brings me to the characters in Final Fantasy VIII, and really, I'm not gonna say that the characters are bad necessarily. They're just kinda there for the most part. Like, there's not really a whole lot of development for most of them. I actually found Squall to be a more enjoyable and somewhat relatable main character this time around. I don't think he lives quite up to the standards of Cloud and Zidane, but I did appreciate Squall more this time around, especially because the game gives you dialogue options in certain instances on whether or not he gives the cold shoulder or if he actually chooses the interesting response, which I could see as being the canon response, especially the further you get and the more he opens up to the party. That's like a huge part of his character development, is his willingness to open up to the crew that he's been traveling with. And so I would recommend, if you're going to play this game, to select the option that isn't just him saying whatever or just brushing people off, because you will get more insight into Squall as a character that way. And he actually had a couple of lines and sometimes internal thoughts that made me laugh out loud, like his thoughts on Laguna on their first meeting, so to speak. But most of the party really don't have much to add to the plot for the most part. They're given stuff to do every so often, but it doesn't really feel like, yeah, that is something that only this character could do and that serves the plot positively because this, and that. It's just kind of like, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, you do this. And any character development that may end up happening doesn't necessarily feel earned. And also some characters' growth will slowly increase, but then just suddenly stop. And then it's just not even a talking point for the rest of the game. Keistis is a great example of this, or I don't know how the fuck it's canonically pronounced because, like, just look at how it's spelled. But Keistis is actually kind of an entertaining character early on. She like teases Squall for being the way that he is and stuff, and that's kind of funny. And she has a couple of moments in like disc 1-ish that show some insight into her character, and then there's just nothing of note from her for the rest of the game, besides just being a party member. Zell seems like a prototype of Ryuji from Persona 5, but without the depth. He's just kind of like that super aggro bro kind of character. Not only do I think his design is really goofy, but I don't know. I don't dislike him per se, but he's also one of those characters that's just kind of there. Selphie, same deal. She's like the bubbly, peppy one, but like aside from flying the airship at the very end of the game, and that's just like a random thing. That's not like something that was built up prior. I don't think it's any spoiler to say that Rinoa is Squall's love interest in the game, or at least it's clear that they'll eventually become an item because of just even the opening cinematic kind of makes that clear. I actually didn't mind Rinoa as much this time around. Most of the character development in the game is between Squall and Rinoa, and I don't know, I didn't mind her this time around. I guess I kind of could understand where she was coming from a bit more, despite some of the stupid decisions and mistakes that she makes, because I think it's realistically stupid given her upbringing in some ways, I guess. And then Irvine has a couple of moments here and there, and of the characters that aren't Squall or Rinoa, probably has the most development of the main cast, but even then there's so much more that could have been done, especially in the foreshadowing department, like when he first meets up with the rest of the party, which I'll get into in the spoiler section. And I want to talk a little bit about the dialogue as well, where when the game is taking itself seriously, like when there's, you know, Seed business going on, and Seed is basically the faction that Squall and friends align with. I don't see a reason to get into detail necessarily. You can get that from the game itself, and I'll probably touch on it in the spoiler section too. But when Squall and company are interacting with like Sid, for instance, and Sid is giving them orders on like what their next mission is or whatever, or whenever Squall and company encounter Laguna in the way that they do, those moments I think are actually pretty cool. But when the game tries to be lighthearted or funny, I find that it just doesn't land most of the time, especially with a lot of the side characters, like, what are their names? Renoa's guys, Zone, and I forget the other guy's name, but they are so painfully unfunny, and they're trying so hard to be funny in the dialogue that it's just kind of annoying. And I don't know, those sections are just kind of obnoxious. And the same thing kind of goes with Fujin and Raijin, who are Cypher's lackeys, and Cypher is kind of like the rival to Squall, as it were. Fujin and Raijin have these vocal tics, kind of similar to like Naruto saying datebeyo at the end of every sentence, right? It's a very Japanese shonen anime kind of thing to have a catchphrase or whatever. And so Raijin has that same tic of saying, you know, or like dateba whatever at the end of his sentences. I just don't think something like that translates very well to text, for the most part, in English at least. So it's just kind of annoying. But then Fujin has this thing where she only speaks in singular words, and it's always all caps, and it's super fucking cringy to me. And then they make her an actual character at like the very end, randomly, kind of. And then I'm like, why couldn't you have just been like a normal human being the entire time? This is like so fucking weird. Their boss fights were pretty good though, at least, but still. And then I mentioned Laguna a couple times. Laguna is one of the better characters in the game for sure. I actually quite enjoyed his segments, and I wish we got more of him, be it in the flashbacks or present day. I think that's enough talking about story and characters for now. Let's jump into gameplay for a bit before I get into story spoilers. So Final Fantasy VIII, of course, is still ATB, as is the case for 4 through 9, and, you know, a couple entries after the fact. But I find that the battles actually flow pretty well in this game compared to 7 and 9. I mean, 9's battles are notoriously slow, and I find 7's animations to just take way too long. I feel like 8 kind of strikes a good balance. I do kind of wish that ATB could fill up while animations are playing, so you could just like set commands to go whenever they're ready kind of deal. I get that that would take a whole complete reworking of the system, but still, like, it flows better than the games that surround it in the series, but it could still flow even better in my opinion. And I should note that I actually played the non-remastered version of FF8 primarily because most people who play on PC tend to recommend you play the original version and not the remaster because of compatibility, or maybe the remaster crashes or something. I'm not exactly sure of the details, but that's what I played. My first playthrough was on the remaster on Switch. But back to gameplay things. The gameplay system in FF8, as most Final Fantasy games, have a very distinct gameplay customization system, even if the core gameplay is pretty much the same. You know, 3 and 5 have the job system, 6 has the Esper system, 7 with materia, 9 with equipment. I don't think there's a name for it necessarily, 10 with the sphere grid, etc., etc. So with 8, you have the junction system, and so there's many facets to this overall customization system, and they all feed into each other. And I do like this system overall, but there are portions of it or aspects to it that I'm not the biggest fan of, and so I'll try to kind of specify because it's a little bit complicated to explain from zero, if that makes sense. So summons in this game are called Guardian Forces, and these can be equipped to your various characters, which can allow you to summon them, but also gives you other abilities as well. And these can be leveled up by participating in battles and stuff. It's kind of like leveling up your materia, or, you know, leveling up your espers and acquiring jobs in 3 and 5 and stuff like that. That part is very similar to prior systems, where you're leveling up your Guardian Forces, as it were, and you can select which skill you want to work towards. And then once you gain enough AP, or whatever they call it in this game, to acquire that skill, then you can select a different skill that you want that Guardian Force to focus on learning. I think the max amount of skills you can learn on a particular GF is 2 pages. And there are certain items that can teach certain GFs certain skills that they otherwise wouldn't, but for the most part, the pool of skills is pretty much set. But that's fine, because if you want a certain character to be more physically oriented, you give them Ifrit, or some of the other ones that are more strength-based or have strength boosting skills and whatnot, right? So that's pretty straightforward. So you equip these Guardian Forces. Now, some of the abilities on these Guardian Forces are junctions. And so this allows you to junction or equip different types of magic to your stats, be it of course, strength, magic, vitality, etc. And this will differ from Guardian Force to Guardian Force. And this can kind of incentivize building certain characters in certain ways. And I say that with a grain of salt because, similar to FF7, it's not like you're permanently altering these character stats. It's solely based on what is currently equipped at the time. And because of the need to swap between parties of 3, since there's 6 total characters, there are several times during the game where you're swapping between 2 separate groups of 3. Sometimes you can choose who's in them, sometimes you can't. Usually there's like a member or 2 that is forced in a particular party. But because of that, and because of the limited amount of Guardian Forces you have, you're going to be swapping junctions between characters, which is pretty easy to do, but it's kind of annoying feeling like you need to do that. And there's just a sense of tedium in general with the menuing with these systems, but I'm not done quite yet. So you equip various types of magic to your stats, right? This can also be equipped to your weapons, be it an elemental attack, a status attack, or resistances to elements or statuses. Now you may be wondering, how do you acquire these types of magic, or what determines how much it alters a stat? So each character can hold up to 100 of each type of magic, and it's all the typical magics that you would see in any other Final Fantasy. There are some, I think, that are exclusive, or at least new to FF8, like double and triple, which are fucking lifesavers on late game bosses and the like. The main way to acquire magic as it's presented to you initially is by drawing magic from various spots on the map or from enemies. So every enemy and every boss has magic, and sometimes Guardian Forces that can be drawn from them using the draw command, which can be equipped through junctions. So each Guardian Force will, allow you to select your different actions in battle. You always have attack, but you can set like draw, summon, or GF as it's labeled, using an item or using various other abilities that have specific functions. And so let's say you have the draw command equipped and you're drawing from enemies early on. You could hypothetically stock up as much as possible, and it's very tempting to do that, especially knowing that you can, but then it feels very grindy. And so the bulk of the grind in this game is through drawing, because enemies and bosses actually scale to your level. So it's kind of incentivized to not grind levels necessarily. You do need to do some grinding if you want to get certain Guardian Force skills, but if I recall correctly, the bosses will give you points towards your Guardian Force skills without giving you actual experience to level up your characters. So the grind comes not from level grinding, but from magic grinding or AP grinding, as it were. And while you can just sit there and draw over and over and over again from enemies, it's going to take fucking forever until you have characters with higher magic stats, which are going to require magic junctions, which are going to require magic to equip to that, etc., etc. But you will hit a certain point in the game where everyone can pretty much junction anything, because there's lots of overlap with junctions between the Guardian Forces that you can equip to your characters. But I think the max that you can draw at once is 9. So it would still take you 12 draws to fully stock a certain type of magic, right? 9 times 11 is 99, plus you need that extra 1. And I believe this is influenced by the magic stack. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm pretty sure that's how it works. But even so, there are refined skills on the Guardian Forces that you can unlock, just like any other skill, that allow you to take certain items and turn them into magic, sometimes in bulk. And then there are certain ones that'll take Cure, for instance, which is the base healing spell. You take like 5 Cures and it makes 1 Cura, which is the next step up. And then you get one where it's like you take 5 Curas and it makes a Curaga. What you really want to do is stock up on a lot of these items that you can refine into the various magics that you might need. And so you might be thinking though, okay, so I've junctioned my characters with certain magic, but then do I really want to be using the magic that's junctioned to those stats? Because that stat's going to be lowered as you use that particular type of magic. And the answer is, it depends. I actually found there were several instances where, particularly in the late game, I was getting less worried about casting magic that I had junctioned because I needed that utility. And so the draw system is incredibly tedious, and inventory management is also incredibly tedious by proxy, because each character can only hold 100. Unless you want to draw and refine for each of the 6 party members each and every type of magic that you want to have available, then you're going to need to be swapping magic around constantly and then switching junctions between characters, which again can be done automatically, but it's kind of hard to keep track of what is equipped to what. Although each character, since they don't have a very distinct gameplay identity, anyone can kind of function as any any type of party member, if that makes sense. In my playthrough, I tended to have Squall be very physically oriented and Rinoa, for instance, being very magically oriented, because their base stats kind of reflect that, but you're pumping up their stats so much that it doesn't really end up mattering too much about min-maxing, I guess. It's more so about setting a build that'll take on a certain boss, and most bosses I was able to scrape by with just whatever I had equipped at the time, but the final boss in particular requires you to have some kind of strategy, because it is a very long fight with increasing levels of bullshit to have to deal with. It was a very satisfying fight, but I digress. So that's generally how the junction system works in general. You have the Guardian Forces, which acquire skills that you junction to characters, which allow you to junction magic to their stats and also equip the various skills that the Guardian Forces acquired. And that is what kind of gives the character that you're playing as their role, as it were, in battle. One of the things I'm not a huge fan of in both 7 and 8 is that each character doesn't really have a distinct gameplay identity, because you're just equipping and unequipping, be it materia or junctions, that give that character their gameplay identity, as opposed to 6 and 9, for instance, where each character kind of has a distinct role, and you can kind of build them in a certain way using the system in a way that permanently affects them instead of just based on what they have currently equipped. So long story short, the flexibility is nice, but I feel like it leaves something to be desired in certain ways as well. Now, as for my solutions for fixing the tedium of particularly the draw system and managing the junction system in general, is for one, just a better explanation of it outright. There's pages and pages and pages of text you could read at the beginning of the game that I'm sure explains this and explains like the political landscape of the game and stuff, but I don't like having to delve into pages and pages and pages of text, whereas this could just be presented gradually as you progress through the game. I suppose it makes repeat playthroughs a little bit less tedious in that way, sort of, if you know what to do. I had a couple of thoughts on how to improve the junction system in the instance of like a remake, or just a hypothetical in general. And that is having some kind of storage for magic in general, so you can store it away and then pull it for certain characters when you need to, instead of having to just always swap between them. Feels a little archaic in that way. But maybe limiting the amount of magic that can be held in the first place, even just cutting it down to 50 or something, would just reduce the tedium. Granted, it would be easier to max out, but maybe you could lessen the impact it has on stats depending on which magic you are equipping, which is something I failed to mention, where healing spells, for instance, increase your HP stat much more than an offensive spell. And you just kind of have to mess around with it and look at how the numbers increase or decrease. There are certain spells that are better suited to be equipped to certain stats, like haste being equipped to your speed, for instance. But yeah, limiting the amount of magic that can be held by each person and having some kind of general storage system would be nice. Another option would be if an FF8 remake had similar like kind of mixed action and ATB sort of elements like 7 Remake does, is having one button dedicated to drawing. Maybe you hold it down or something and it just like draws magic. Maybe your magic stat could influence how quickly you're able to draw, but it could just be a simple, you hold it down and you draw until you're full or something like that. Even just limiting the amount that you can draw from each enemy I think would be good too, although sometimes you are drawing from enemies to not stock it, but to cast it immediately. And there are some bosses, particularly early on, that give you access to spells through drawing from them that actually help with their particular gimmick. Like there's a boss early on that inflicts status ailments on you, where you haven't really seen many status ailments prior, and he gives you access to Isuna. I think that's how it's pronounced. I've never heard it said. Even so, you might not have that spell initially, and so you would need to draw it to be able to cast it, assuming he didn't silence you already. So there's a lot of different elements at play here, but I think having the draw function be a dedicated thing in the instance of a remake would make sense. Another thing I would like to see is just more distinct differences between the characters besides just limit breaks, which limit breaks function differently in this game. Instead of you take damage and it fills up the gauge and you're just basically spamming limit breaks the entire time because why not? They look cool, I guess, but it's kind of just like whatever. But in FF8, limit breaks have a chance to trigger when you're at low health. I don't know the exact percentage, but you can use this to your benefit actually by intentionally staying at low health until you're able to activate the limit break and then healing after the limit break is already selected, assuming you're lucky enough for it to proc in the first place, and there are ways to manipulate that too. But maybe to differentiate the characters, there could be some kind of limit on either what magic can be equipped to who, or maybe certain types of magic or certain junctions to certain stats have a lesser impact on certain characters. Like Zell and Squall maybe get more of a boost to their strength by junctioning strength and less of a boost to their magic or something like that, and Rinoa vice versa. I don't know, something to make the characters feel a little more distinct than just whatever is currently equipped to them, because I'm just not really the biggest fan fan of that. And you add to that most of the characters not being characterized particularly thoroughly, and it just leaves me not really caring about this cast much at all, which is kind of a big deal when it comes to a JRPG. I think they could be done so much more justice, or at least I would like to think. I can't really definitively say what they would expound on. They'd probably have to make some stuff up for some of these characters that have just some kind of personality trope. And maybe there's some stuff you can dig for elsewhere that you could expound on for characterization of these guys, but generally that's pretty lacking. I don't mean to harp on it too much, but it's probably the most glaring weakness of the game. Now I'm gonna get into spoilers, so if you haven't played FF8 and you have plans to, I would recommend turning away and then coming back once you finished it. If you don't care, then like feel free to stick around, it's whatever. And then of course if you finish the game and you just want to hear what I have to say spoiler wise, then yeah, keep watching. So I mentioned there were some plot points that seemed contrived on a first pass that I didn't mind as much this time through, or at least I was able to brace myself for when they were going to happen, and so it didn't off-put me as much and didn't cause me to dismiss what happened after the fact. The main one is the orphanage memory loss reveal, where Irvine joins the party without a Guardian Force equipped. And it turns out that Guardian Forces deteriorate your memory or something. I really wish that this was expounded on more in the story as opposed to just being a gameplay system, because it is mentioned a few times that Guardian Forces, like, they're acknowledged. It's not like in a lot of Final Fantasy games where summons aren't really fully acknowledged, right? Like you're summoning these fucking demigods from like some other plane or something, and no one says shit. It's just like, oh, casually have a fucking Ifrit materia around. Like in this game, summons actually exist in the world and you kind of recruit them in a way. And I actually did go out of my way to recruit some of the optional ones, not all of them, but a few of them. I thought that was pretty cool. But there is like almost no foreshadowing for this Guardian Forces cause memory loss kind of thing, or like really expounding on how exactly they are equipped to the characters and stuff. I want more of that. Give me the intricacies of how Guardian Forces work in universe, not just gameplay wise. So that way this reveal, which I'm going to explain, doesn't seem to come out of left field, where it turns out that everyone in the main cast except for Renoa, and also including Cypher, who's not part of the party, grew up in the same orphanage when they were kids, and then they were sent off to the various gardens to grow up to be, you know, warriors for Seed and fight the sorceress. It turns out that Irvine, because he never equipped a Guardian Force, at least prior to joining your party, he remembered and recognized everyone when they first met him at Galbadia Garden. Maybe he acts a little bit weird, but he's not really acting like someone who would have recognized his old childhood friends and they don't recognize him. Like, I get that if he tried to be like, hey guys, how's it going? Or like, oh my god, it's been so long, and they were kind of like, what? Do we know you? That's one thing, but it's another thing for him to just like not really say shit about it. I guess he was able to see that they didn't recognize him, but I think so much more could have been done with that initially to kind of build up towards this reveal, which overall I think is kind of fine. It's just the way it's presented makes it feel extremely contrived without the context being known ahead of time. Another plot point that kind of gets touched on and thrown away is Norg, who is like, I guess the official owner or like shareholder of some kind of Balamb Garden. But Norg is a character, I'm like, what the fuck is this species? They're like Shumi or whatever. There's a Shumi village, which I didn't visit, so I guess there's probably some kind of explanation if you go there or something. But that came out of left field and then just like isn't talked about really again in the main story, so feels kind of just out of left field in general. I do think the whole Edea brainwashing sorceress thing actually does make sense, and I'm going to talk about some fan theories in a second too. This entire game, for those obviously who finished it, you know this already, but for those who are still listening who don't care about spoilers, the game is a giant time loop where you start from some kind of arbitrary point in the loop. It's not really a significant point in the loop necessarily, but you go all the way until the start of the loop. And there's a whole complicated explanation for why that is. I guess I can explain, but like I kind of feel like you should just play the game yourself if you're interested in this, and if you've already played it, then you know what exactly it is. I actually fucking really like the whole time loop concept. I think it's really damn cool, but it does feel a little bit contrived on a first glance when you have Elone sending Squall and company back in time to view Laguna's memories, but she's trying to send them back to change things, but they can only really witness things. But then the way that that power is used in order to unfuse Renoa and Ultimacia, because Ultimacia is like the ultimate sorceress. She's like the big bad. It's kind of hard to explain without having anything written down on this, but I'll do my best. Near the end of the game, Squall and company go through what's called time compression in order to get to where Ultimacia is, which is in the far future. And so without going into too much detail, they get sent to the far future. It actually does kind of make sense within the context of how they explain it. They get to the far future, but then they need to come back once they defeat her, so as to not be trapped in the future. Squall gets lost along the way and ends up showing up at the orphanage around the time that he was a kid. And the matron of the orphanage, Edea, is then possessed by Ultimecia, who basically followed Squall in her shambling state. And so she kind of passed her powers on to Edea as being the next sorceress, even though it's in the past relative to Ultimecia. This shit's super fucking confusing. Oh my god. It actually makes sense if you play the game, but I don't think I'm doing a great job of explaining it. But then Edea goes on to be the big bad sorceress during Squall and Company's formative years, you know, once they're teenagers in Garden and whatnot. And so this is why Irvine can't take the shot at Edea when they're assigned to assassinate her. This is why I think the Squall is dead theory is kind of stupid. I read another kind of opposing theory that Edea was able to kind of hold back against Squall so as to not fatally wound him. Because I think Edea and Ultimecia strike some kind of pact where Edea refuses to be Ultimecia's host unless she doesn't harm the kids who were at the orphanage, right? And so I think Edea / Ultimecia knows this and holds back when she shoots those like ice spikes into Squall. And so I think the whole Squall is dead after just one thing is like kind of dumb, because that kind of diminishes like the entire rest of the fucking game and the whole time loop thing. Not a huge fan of that. I am kind of a fan of the Renoa is Ultimecia theory, but I don't know how much weight it actually holds. I like it in concept, and I think it would be kind of cool if they leaned into that in a remake, even if that wasn't intentional or provable with the source material. Because I kind of like the idea of Squall and Griever kind of being the same thing somehow. I don't really know how it's possible given the current context, but I like the idea because Renoa is a sorceress at a certain point and inherits the powers of Ultimecia. And so Squall has to make the decision, because he kind of fell for Renoa, of having to like save her from being confined because she's a sorceress and is too dangerous to be like, you know, free amongst the populace. Like I said, I'm several weeks removed from my playthrough, and I don't think I'm doing a great job of explaining things, but generally I think the time loop thing is cool. I just can't help but feel that disc 3 and 4 feel a little bit rushed. So many wild things are happening back to back that I'm not surprised that I kind of dismissed this like last third to quarter of the game on my first playthrough because of how wild and outlandish everything seems. But if you just give it a chance and you actually make it to the end, which, like I said, that final boss is quite a doozy, but I kind of liked it. I did come up with a particular strat for that fight. It was super memorable, and I'm glad that I actually did it, you know? I guess I can just touch on some other things I'd like to see expounded on in a remake, because I don't really feel like I have much more to say specifically. I think characters just need more development and more depth. And this goes for supporting characters and antagonists as well. Like Cypher in concept is a cool foil to Squall, sort of. Oh, and that brings me to, I completely forgot. I like the idea that each character kind of represents different styles of dealing with grief or whatever. Not like the stages of grief, but it's kind of, or maybe it is. It's something like that, where how each of these characters deals with trauma is very different, where like Cypher is still chasing, trying to protect someone kind of thing. Squall kind of isolates himself from everyone. Selphie covers it all up with like bubbly, happy, fun times. Zell covers it up with anger, etc., etc. I think that's kind of interesting, but there just needs to be more. And we also need more Laguna. The fact that Squall and Laguna, like, Squall is clearly Laguna's son, but the fact that this is not acknowledged directly at all is fucking really stupid. It wouldn't be a huge heartfelt, like, let's embrace, because Squall just isn't really that kind of character, and neither is Laguna. But there needs to be some kind of recognition of at least, like, Squall looks at Laguna funny and he, like, winks at him or something, or, like, gives him a head nod or something, anything. And that just kind of feeds more into, I think, discs 3 and 4 just feel awkwardly paced compared to the first two discs. Now, with any luck, I didn't forget anything significant. And yeah, those are kind of my mostly broad thoughts on Final Fantasy VIII. A very unique game in a lot of ways, and it definitely doesn't stick the landing in certain aspects, but it was enjoyable enough. I can't say for certain that I'll play it again, but it's definitely possible that I do, especially if there doesn't end up being a remake, because then there's not really any other way to experience it. But at the same time, as fascinating as I find the story, and as much as I kind of like the gameplay systems in concept, I find that the execution of the gameplay systems and also the characters just leave a lot to be desired, and don't really have me feeling particularly strongly about this game one way or another. I definitely don't dislike it as much as I used to, but while I do appreciate it more than I once did, I wouldn't say that I'm like the biggest FF8 fan ever either. I'm kind of like somewhere in the middle, I guess, where I can see both the pros and the cons, and they don't really sway me towards one side or the other. Not that taste in video games is black and white like that, but you know what I mean. So let me know what you think about Final Fantasy VIII in the comments. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, of course, if you enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next video.